In the previous lesson, we looked at the get superglobal, and we used it to retrieve information from the URL, or the query string, to be more specific. And remember that I said that get requests are for retrieving information. We're not using a get request to make any changes to our data store or to change the state of our application. And we definitely don't want to use a get request if any sensitive information is involved, like a password or something even more sensitive, because all of that stuff appears within the URL. So anytime that you need to work with sensitive information, or you want to make changes to your data store or to the state of your application, you use what's called a POST request, and you retrieve the POST information with a superglobal called _POST. And it is an array. It works exactly like the get superglobal. We specify our key that gives us our value. So we're done. I will see you in the next lesson. I'm kidding. We need to talk about how you issue a POST request. Because in HTML, there's really just one way to do that, and that is with a form. Now, if you are submitting form data with JavaScript, then it's a little bit more flexible in that you can submit a POST request that way. But we are primarily just sticking with HTML. So the first thing we need is a form. And there is this action attribute. Now, the action attribute is the file that is going to handle the POST request. So if you leave this empty, then it's going to default to the current page, and that page is login.php inside of the 3.2 folder. And in most cases, that's what you want. So we're going to leave that alone. Now we do need to come in here and we need to say method equals post, so that it is going to issue a post request whenever we submit this form. So now we just need some fields, and since we are using Bootstrap, we are going to use some of its organizational classes. So we're going to create a div element with a form group class. We need a label inside of this, and this is going to be for our username or for our email address. So let's say that this is for email, and the text is going to be email. Now we need an input element. The type can be text. We could go ahead and use HTML5's email, but for now we're going to just use text, just in case if we wanted to later on test the filter input, because we could validate this information to ensure that it is an email. And if we set this to email and we try to submit something that isn't an email address, then the browser is going to prevent us from issuing a request. So we're just going to stick with test for now. In a real application, yes, we would want to use email. So we want the name to be email and we want the ID to be email. So we need both a name and an ID for this reason. The value of the name attribute is going to be the key that we use to access that information in our POST superglobal. So if we wanted to retrieve the email value, then we would do so like this. And if we changed the name attribute to, for some reason, email2, in order to get that information, we would also need to make that change when we specify the key. So if you omit the name attribute, you will not be able to retrieve that information from the POST request. So every field that you want to work with has to have a name attribute. The ID attribute is there so that whenever the user clicks on the label, it gives focus to the form control. So that is why there's both a name and an ID. And we also need a class here. So this is going to be form, not group, control. And that is going to be fine for our email field. Now we need a password, so let's change the type to password. We, of course, need to change the name and ID. We'll just set those to password as well. And the for attribute for our label, and then the text is going to be password. And then we need a button to submit. So let's create another form group, and inside of this, we will have our input element. So, or we could use a button. I just typically use an input element with a type of submit. And we could put a name here, and I will tell you why we could do that and why we might want to do that here in a little bit, but for now we're just going to leave the name alone. And for the value, we're just going to have as login. So we have our form. Let's make sure that this is going to look okay. Let's make that request. And there we go. Although we can already see that there's a problem here, because I have code up here at the top where I am trying to retrieve something from the post global called email. And it says that there is this undefined index email. Well, the reason why we are seeing this is because I just made a GET request. I went to the URL, I press enter, that's a GET request. So of course there is nothing in the post superglobal. So here's how we can handle this. One of the ways is to check to see if it is a post request. And we can do that by using another superglobal called _server. This contains what are called server variables, and one of those is in all caps, request_method. This is going to give us the type of request that was made. So if it was a GET request, this is going to be equal to GET in all uppercase. If it's a POST request, then it will be POST in all uppercase. So if the server request method was POST, then we want to use our POST superglobal. So let's just paste that code in. Whenever we go back and refresh, that's now gone. If we make a form submission by clicking on the login button, well, we didn't have anything there. So let's go ahead and type something into the email address. It doesn't matter what it is. And password is going to be password. Whenever I submit the form, well, we're not really doing anything, are we? We need to echo here. So let's echo that email address. Now, whenever you issue a post request and you hit the refresh, it's going to ask you, do you want to issue that same post request? So it's going to take the information that you had just submitted and resubmit it if you click on continue. Let's go ahead and do that because I don't want to type everything again. So there we go. We have the email address that was used. But we can also do something like this. If this is a post request, then we can use our output function and we can output our post superglobal. And then we will see the entire contents of that array. So here we have the array, we have the email, which was that, and then we have the password, which I typed as password. But notice that there wasn't anything for the submit button, and that's because I did not give it a name. Now, in the case of where you have a page with multiple forms, and you want the same PHP file to handle multiple forms, that is where having a name attribute for your submit button would be useful. Because then that way, you can determine which form was submitted based upon the presence of that button name in the post. So we need to make a fresh GET request so that our new HTML is loaded. And let's type in something different. user@user.com, 1234 is the password. So now whenever we submit, we have email, password, and login. So inside of our code, if we wanted to determine which form was submitted, we can just use isSet, and then we will check our post superglobal for that button. That was called login. So if this was set, then we know that we received a request for logging in. And let's just resubmit, and we see our output there. However, if you just have a single form, I recommend the other approach, just checking to see the type of request, because more often than not, that's what is going to be sufficient. And plus, that's just one less thing that you have to manage. If you give your submit button a name and there's only one form in that page, then you have to manage that name. Now, one thing to remember is that this is still user input. It can still be manipulated by the user, and therefore we need to distrust everything that is coming from the user. So the first thing we really need to do is validate this information. So we can, first of all, check to see if we have a valid email address by using the filter_input function. Except in this case, we aren't going to say input get like we did in the previous lesson. We're going to say input post. And then we specify the name of the field that we want to retrieve, and then we specify the filter that we want to use. So in this case, we want to filter validate email. That way we will ensure that we have an actual email. And we could check if email equals false, then we could display a message. So we could create a variable called status, and we could say that please enter a valid email address. So that's down here somewhere. Let's say after our form, and really after the div element there. Let's give this a class of row. And that's not, well, let's just do this. Div, we'll give this a class of row so that this is on a new line. And then we will check to see if our status is set. So we'll say if is set, and then status, then we will echo status. And we need to close our PHP block. So now let's make a fresh GET request so that everything is reloaded. And let's submit something that is not a valid email address. You can see how many that I've used in the past. So let's just do something like 1234. That's obviously not a valid email address. Password, let's do 1234 as well. Whenever we click on log on or log in, we see that we did not have a valid email address, so we are being prompted to please enter a valid email address. However, if we change this to a type of email, then the browser is going to catch that. However, don't rely upon the browser to do your validation for you, because not everybody is going to be using a browser that supports HTML5 form controls. Always validate information. Even if you think that it's going to be done client-side, assume that it's not. So validate everything. And so the things to remember are that your fields, if you want to work with them in a post request, need to have a name attribute. If you have multiple forms in the same file and they are all going to be processed by the same file, give a name attribute to your submit buttons. And before you start processing post information, make sure you have a post request. If you have just a single form, just a simple check for the request method is sufficient. But if you have multiple forms, check for the name of the button, and then you can process the post information as you need to. Well, in the next lesson, we are going to take this a step further and start implementing a simple user authentication system. And we will keep track whether or not a user is logged in, and we will use the session superglobal to do that.